Now, the fact that Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote an entire chapter on the Negro criminal, this lets us know that crime was not something small, but rather a central part of the Black experience in Philadelphia. So right now, we're going to cover the early history of Negro crime in the city and see how it evolved. And so let's do that by continuing from the book, The Philadelphia Negro. Respect. From his earliest advent, the Negro, as was natural, has figured largely in the criminal annals of Philadelphia. Since Negroes have first lived in Philadelphia, they have played a major role in crime. So what is crime? The breaking of laws that humans have established within a society, which could be petty things like not being able to go to an area based solely on skin color, or it could be serious things like robbing people. But as we'll see, the Negro was responsible for a bit of both in the criminal annals of Philadelphia. Only such superficial study of the American Negro as dates his beginning with 1863 can neglect this past record of crime in studying the present. To get a fuller picture of Negro crime, you can't just begin with emancipation in 1863. You have to go before that, which is what he's going to do in a bit. Crime is a phenomenon of organized social life and is the open rebellion of an individual against his social environment. Similar to what was mentioned earlier, crime is the result of people going against the rules of the society. Naturally, then, if men are suddenly transported from one environment to another, the result is lack of harmony with the new conditions. They may not fully understand the expectations of the new society, and things that would be permissible in their old society may be criminalized in the new environment. Right? It's not always intentional criminality, but sometimes old ways clash with the new society's expectations, especially when it comes to petty crimes. Lack of harmony with the new physical surroundings leading to disease and death or modification of physique. Lack of harmony with social surroundings leading to crime. Thus, very early in the history of the colony, characteristic complaints of the disorder of the Negro slaves is heard. Here we go. Penn himself introduced a law for the special trial and punishment of Negroes very early in the history of the colony, as has been noted before, referring to William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania. The slave code finally adopted was mild compared with the legislation of the period, but it was severe enough to show the unruly character of many of the imported slaves. Especially in Philadelphia did the Negroes continue to give general trouble, not so much by serious crime as by disorder, which is important to distinguish. The Negroes in Philadelphia weren't so much involved with serious crime like robbery, homicide, rape, kidnapping, and aggravated assault. Their crimes were more of disorderly conduct at this time. In 1732, under Mayor Hazel, the city council, taking under consideration the frequent and tumultuous meetings of the Negro slaves, especially on Sunday, gaming, cursing, swearing, and committing many other disorders, to the great terror and disquiet of the inhabitants of this city, ordered an ordinance to be drawn up against such disturbances. You see, it was less severe things like cursing and gambling, which the inhabitants of the city viewed as a disturbance, and they had the right to feel that way and draw up ordinances against it. Again, 6 years later, we hear of the draft of another city ordinance for the more effectual suppressing tumultuous meetings and other disorderly doings of the Negroes, mulattoes, and Indian servants and slaves, gathered together, being chaotic, excessively loud, and other conduct that is viewed as disorderly in public. The people didn't want to be surrounded by that behavior, so they made ordinances to stop it. And in 1741, August 17th, frequent complaints having been made of the board that many disorderly persons meet every evening about the courthouse of this city, and great numbers of Negroes and others sit there with milk pails and other things late night, and many disorders are there committed against the peace and good government of this city. It mentioned great numbers of Negroes and others, which I assume the others could be poor whites or natives, who were in the late night all disturbing the peace. Council ordered the place to be cleared in half an hour after sunset. Simple solution, right? Of the graver crimes by Negroes, we have only reports here and there which do not make it clear how frequently such crimes occurred. Now we're dealing with serious crimes. In 1706, a slave is arrested for setting fire to a dwelling. In 1738, 3 Negroes are hanged in neighboring parts of New Jersey for poisoning people, while at Rocky Hill a slave is burned alive for killing a child and burning a barn. All violent crimes and worthy of punishment. But like Dr. Du Bois mentioned, Negroes were scarcely reported for committing these types of crimes. So these few instances don't indicate the actual frequency in which they occurred. But I'm inclined to believe that it did not take place very often, because it seems more likely that the whites would have reported these acts than not. So I think it was rare for Negroes to commit these violent crimes in the early periods in Philadelphia. Whipping of Negroes at the public whipping post was frequent, and so severe was the punishment that in 1743, a slave brought up to be whipped committed suicide, which was wild, wasn't it? In 1762, 2 Philadelphia slaves were sentenced to death for felony and burglary. Petitions were circulated in their behalf, but counsel was obdurate. They refused to change their mind. They were adamant on sending Negroes to negative existence over burglary, which was wild. Little special mention of Negro crime is again met with until the freedmen under the Act of 1780 began to congregate in the city, and other free immigrants joined them. Philadelphia began freeing Negroes, and afterwards they started migrating into the city. It was at this point when Negro crime again became a hot topic in Philadelphia. In 1809, the leading colored churches united in a society to suppress crime and were cordially endorsed by the public for this action. And that's how you know it was legitimate. The colored church got involved in an attempt to suppress it before it was allowed to multiply in the city. And the thing is, they had a strong incentives to stop it, because if they didn't, it was going to fall back on them anyways, and the entire black reputation in the city. Because like he said earlier in the book, the whites didn't distinguish between these different classes of blacks. They lumped them all together. After the war, immigration to the city increased, and the stress of hard times bore heavily on the lower classes. After the War of 1812, more blacks arrived into the city and fell into hard times. Complaints of petty thefts and murderous assaults on peaceable citizens now began to increase, and in numbers of cases they were traced to Negroes. Now Negroes are moving from the petty crimes into stealing and seriously injuring or killing people who weren't bothering anyone. This is when the crime becomes barbaric and inexcusable. The better class of colored citizens felt the accusation and held a meeting to denounce crime and take a firm stand against their own criminal class. The better class of Negroes weren't doing this madness, but they shared the same reputation with the blacks who were doing it. So at that point, they had to jump into the fight to suppress the criminal class before it was allowed to multiply. A little later, the Negro riots commenced, and they received their chief moral support from the increasing crime of Negroes. These were the riots in the 1830s, when the whites viciously attacked Negroes in the streets and burned down their buildings. They too commenced to barbarism. And what gave the white mobs their major excuse to commit these barbaric acts was the increase in crime committed by Negroes. A Cuban slave brained his master with a hatchet, 2 other murders by Negroes followed, and gambling, drunkenness, and debauchery were widespread wherever Negroes settled. That's how the 7th Ward became stained with black marks on streets like 7th and Lombard. Certain Negroes commencing in wild behavior wherever they settled. Now, right here is a table that shows some penitentiary statistics for the most serious crimes in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. We see here the total number of serious crimes committed. Then here, the number of Negroes who committed them. Then what percentage of those serious crimes were committed by Negroes? And lastly, the Negro population in terms of percentage. And we can see that Negroes were imprisoned for a large portion of these crimes, despite being a relatively low percentage of the population. Or to put it differently, the problem of Negro crime in Philadelphia from 1830 to 1850 arose from the fact that less than 1/14 of the population was responsible for nearly a third of the serious crimes committed. You see that? Negroes were 1/14 of the population and responsible for almost 1/3 of the serious crimes. We're not talking about petty crimes like cursing and hanging around downtown. We're talking about serious crimes. And anyone with a working set of eyes would be able to see what problem this could turn into if allowed to multiply. These figures, however, are apt to relate more especially to a criminal class, meaning the criminals are from a specific group of Negroes and not all the Negroes in general. A better measure of the normal criminal tendencies of the group would perhaps be found in the statistics of Moyamensing, where ordinary cases of crime and misdemeanor are confined and which contains only county prisoners. The figures for Moyamensing prison are right here. Total white prisoners in a 20-year period is right here. Total Negro prisoners is right here. The percentage of prisoners which were Negroes and the percentage of the population that was Negroes is right here. And he's about to give some more detail on why this may have been the case, so pay attention. Of course, there are some considerations which must not be overlooked in interpreting these figures for 1836 to 55. It must be remembered that the discrimination against the Negro was much greater then than now. He was arrested for less cause and given longer sentences than whites. Great numbers of those arrested and committed for trial were never brought to trial, so that their guilt could not be proven or disproven. Of 737 Negroes committed for trial in 6 months of the year 1837, it is stated that only 123 were actually brought to trial. Of the prisoners in the Eastern Penitentiary, 1829 to 1846, 14% of the whites were pardoned and 2% of the Negroes. All these considerations increased the statistics to the disfavor of the Negro. So the statistics were likely exaggerated due to the pettiness and prejudice of the police, who were the whites. Nevertheless, making all reasonable allowances, it is undoubtedly true that the crime of Negroes in this period reached its high tide for this city, meaning he believed Negroes were actually doing a lot of crime, even after accounting for bias and unfair policing. The fact remains that this period was their highest level of crime. The character of the crimes committed by Negroes compared with whites is shown by the following table. Offenses versus the person are things like battery and killing, actions that one person does directly to another. So for whites, 11.4% of their crimes fell into this category, while it was 12.4% for Negroes. Now, this percentage represents the percentage of their own group's total crime, not the percentage of the city's overall crime. So understand that. Now, next, the category we have here is offenses versus property with violence, which is stealing property or breaking into homes and using some form of violence in the process of doing so. And from the total number of crimes committed by whites, 13.1% were these types. And for the Negro, 22.9%, which was a significantly higher percentage. Ooh-wee. Next is the same category but without violence, and we see that whites and blacks were similar at 59.8 and 60.2% respectively. Then we have malicious offenses versus property, which is basically destroying people's property without intending to steal it, just being destructive, right? And so the whites have 1.5% and blacks were at 2%. Then forgery, we see that whites had a significantly higher rate of 11.5% compared to the Negroes' 1%. And then last, we have the miscellaneous crimes, which is everything else that didn't fit within these categories. And whites were at an astounding 27%, while the Negroes were at 1.5%. And the total number of offenses for whites were 1,359, and for blacks, 718. Which was extremely high in proportion to their population. But we have to consider the prejudice and the biased circumstances when looking at some areas in these statistics, as mentioned earlier by Dr. Du Bois. So with that being said, this here was an early history of the Negro criminals in Philadelphia. And so hopefully you've got something out of this. I thank you for your time and attention. We're going to go through some more coming up because there's a whole chapter on this. So stay tuned. And so I thank you for your time and attention. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.